You're listening to a podcast from Global Art Forum 12. This session is called Report from the Serpentine Marathon 2017 and features Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Ben Vickers. We're now going to move on to our next session, which is also a kind of prelude to the session after. As I mentioned earlier, we've had the pleasure of collaborating with the Serpentine Gallery and with the Serpentine Marathon. And so we thought it would be interesting for you and for us to return to the last marathon from last October. And to present that, we have Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the artistic director of the Serpentine Gallery, and Ben Vickers, who's the chief technical officer. And then they're going to immediately segue into the session after, also as hosts, joined by two new guests. So will you please join me in welcoming Ben Vickers and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Thank you.
Thank you, Schumann. Thank you very, very much. As we always say, the Global Art Forum and the Serpentine is 1 + 1 = at least 11. Ben and I are very delighted to be here today and present you with some of the findings of the marathon. We are grateful to Mirna, to Schumann, to Patricia, to Noah, and everybody else here. And basically, before maybe talking a little bit about the marathon, I wanted to kind of put it in the bigger picture of the Serpentine's engagement with technology. For Jana Pihl, our CEO, myself as the artistic director, Ben as the chief technology officer, and our teams, it's a very big priority to kind of work with new experiments in art and technology. And that, of course, connects to Billy Kluver and his visionary experiments in art and technology in the 1960s onwards. But it also connects to John Latham and Barbara Stevini, the visionary English artist who came up with an idea of the artist placement group, the APG, where they actually decided that they wanted to position art in the center of society so that actually every major corporation and every major, public and private organization would have an artist in residence. So that's something we pursue at the Serpentine, and started with Pedro Reyes, who was in City Hall, and it's something which is ongoing and happens also with a lot of technology companies now increasingly. And at the root of that idea is, of course, Marshall McLuhan, who has noted the ability of art to anticipate the future. In the foreword to his book, Understanding Media, he calls art an early alarm system, which I always thought is very beautiful, which is pointing us to new developments in times ahead and allowing us to prepare to cope with them. He says art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. In 1964, when his book was first published, the artist Nam June Paik, who has also been mentioned here as a pioneer for what we're going to talk about later, was just building his robot K456 to experiment with the technologies that subsequently would start to influence society. He had worked with television earlier, challenging its usual way of consuming, and later made art with global live satellite broadcasts to use the new media less for entertainment, but as he said, to point us to their poetic and intercultural capacities. And I think that is very relevant for today if we engage with technology, to not forget that this is not about entertainment, but this is about poetic and intercultural capacities. The marathon as a format is ideal, of course, for bringing the different disciplines together, to go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. We came up with this idea around 2005, initially in the theater world, and then implemented it in the Serpentine Gallery. It's a knowledge festival between 24 and 48 hours, where 50, 60 speakers address a theme from many different angles. And so last year, in 2017, the theme was the guest, the ghost, the host, machine marathon, dealing with issues such as AI, artificial intelligence, and of course we agree with the preceding panel that we need neologisms for that, and shouldn't call it necessarily AI. I mean, Hito Steyerl, in one of the first speeches, talked about AI and AS, artificial intelligence and artificial stupidity. So this sort of search for neologisms, and of course questions. The marathon is always a rendezvous of question marks, to quote the great Molly Nesbitt. And here are a few questions which came up in the marathon. Walter Marsh said the ghost is in the machine, but what is the machine? It's kind of a great question. The ghost is in the machine, but what is in the machine? That is very much a question which resonates, of course, with another visionary, with Cedric Price, who came up with the Interdisciplinary Art Organization. And he said, technology is the answer. What is the question? That's also something which I think is relevant today. Some of the further questions which came up during a marathon: is art changing in the age of artificial intelligence? What are the emerging relationships between machines and a human spirit? If we don't know what consciousness is, how can we qualify intelligence? Are we too late to define the ethics of our machines? Does the future belong to non-human entities? And is the existential threat real? Now, it's a very difficult task here in 10 or 15 minutes to summarize the marathon, because, as I said, it was a 24-hour
So one of the things
event.
that we did is we bought the booklets so that you could pass them around, and so everyone can have a look whilst we're speaking, because we only have 15 minutes. So if you could take one and maybe just in this 10 minutes just look around.
Yeah, we only have 50 minutes because we promised to
But we've
Schumann
also got
that this will not be a
slides.
marathon.
We've got 46 slides, so we can quickly go through this. Am I taking over now?
Yeah, I think, it's ping and pong.
Okay, so if we go back to the beginning of the day, we had Gilbert and George opening with their pharmacology. I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to say that. And throughout the day, I think to pick up on Hans-Ulrich's point about the questions that were outlined and underpinned the marathon, we totally agree with that position that artificial intelligence is a problematic stand-in term, but it is what we have. And so what we really attempted to do in a I guess, a non-technical space was to present a plurality, and to present a plurality in such a way that I don't even think is really present in the kind of engineering spheres. So we did bring engineers. We brought individuals from DeepMind. We had a particularly wonderful conversation between the artist Ian Cheng, who I will speak about a little bit if we get to those slides, and the AI developer Richard Evans, who is, I think, a personal hero both for me and Ian, and has been part of the kind of genesis story around DeepMind, working with Demis Hazzabist when he was 16, developing the first artificial intelligence for Theme Park. Richard Evans also responsible for the creation of the artificial intelligence in Lionhead Studios for Black and White, but also The Sims. So, and we tried in every instance to try and marry together individuals from the technology sphere, from philosophy, from the arts, as the marathon always does. Another particular highlight for me, and I think connects slightly to some of the points that were touched on before in the last conversation, was Kenrick McDowell and Jason Louv. Kenrick McDowell is the curator and one of the creators of the Artist Machine Intelligence Group at Google, responsible for the release of Deep Dream, in conversation with Jason Louv, who describes himself in many ways, has worked on NASA programs, has just published a book on the occultist John Dee, a very interesting individual. And what they attempted to do was to begin to unpick and go back to the sort of genesis point for the sorts of artificial intelligence that are generated by Western companies and how they are based in a Judeo-Christian belief system of monotheism, and try to present essentially a sort of thought experiment to understand what it would mean to base it on, say, Buddhist beliefs, and what kind of AI we would produce as a result of that, and to encourage an entirely different theology around that. And I think that particular conversation spoke a lot to what we were attempting to do in the marathon, was to take the conversation where it hasn't necessarily been before, but maybe is happening backstage right now, but also to push a pluralistic agenda that would force people into facing up to some of the foundations and not being not being over mystified by the words artificial intelligence or neural networks or black box or whatever other terms people choose to associate with this emerging magical condition.
And before we tell you maybe a little bit more about Ian Chang, because of course also as part of this engagement with this technology, it's not only discursive platforms like the Marathon, but we really want to produce reality. Hence work with artists such as Ian Chang or Hito Steil and others on major new commissions. So we want to talk about that as well. But to kind of wrap it up on the Marathon, one thing also which maybe helps us to summarize this marathon is actually the excellent summary which Hugh Lemmy has written. We commissioned Hugh Lemmy to summarize on a few pages, the kind of key findings of the marathon. And he came up with a whole series of actually 8 categories of kind of 8 themes. Welcome Home is the first chapter, where engineer Jimena Canales was for me a personal highlight, opened her presentation. A discourse with one of the most popular everyday examples of AR, the Apple Assistance Technology Siri, with 2 questions. Hi Siri, how are you? I'm happy to be alive. Are you human? I'm not sure that matters. So these, very simple questions underpin, as Lemmy says, both the promise and potential threat of AI. At what point can computers be regarded as having gained genuine intelligence, something we regard as intrinsically a human characteristics, and what are the implications for our own sense of self in what we were to happen? The second point is, what does AI need to eat? And that's actually interesting because Ben in a minute will tell us more about Ian and the birth of Bob. It's the first art exhibition ever which has a nervous system. And of course, Bob needs to be fed. So that was point number 2. What does AI need to eat? The third point you summarized is the future of productivity. Looking at AI and its sister concept, automation. And that will actually be the theme of the next marathon we're doing in 2018, which will be the future of work, because we're going to look at the future of work, at questions such as general basic income, and we're going to work with Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher. And that's the thing I omitted to mention before, that each of these marathons is a collaboration with somebody from outside the Serpentine. So we work on it, Jana Peel, Ben, myself, our curators of the marathon, Lucia Pietro Justi and Claude Agile. But it's very important that we always bring in a co-curator from outside. And in the case of the Ghost Guest Host Machine Marathon about AI, it was the collective RAX, the RAX Media Collective, who co-curated it with us. And this year in 2018, about the future of work, it will be Bernard Stiegler. And that will, of course, be about questions as general basic income, but also conditional general basic income. Stiegler is very interested in, to distinguish a conditional and a unconditional general basic income. So we hope you can all come in September to London for that marathon. So that was point number 3, the future of productivity. I deviated because of it connecting to this year's theme. Point number 4 is phantasmagoria, so phantasmagoric issues with Adam Thirlwell, and of course the amazing presentation of Shumon Bazar and Fatima Al-Qadari, which was basically the connection, the collaboration with the Global Art Forum was part of that category. The 5th category, rituals, a stable meaning. Arthur C. Clarke once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So that was a whole chapter where we address magic. Point number 6 was the human tributes for a human God. Ben already mentioned that with Jason Liu. The good and evil battle, or the good and evil final battle narrative into AI. If we pursue that route, we're going to get an apocalyptic outcome, as Jason said. So that's not the way to go. Number 7, Ben also touched upon, actually, to be summarized under modeling sociality. And that, of course, is that conversation with Richard Evans, because the idea that very often, the social dimension is not mentioned in discussions about AI, or what we formerly used to call AI, and now hopefully are going to, in the course of today or the near future, find a neologism. Point number 8, finally, is the orb vision, the question of 360-degree panoramic view. And I will hand over now to Ben, who will tell us more about this, in the last part, about this concrete example of Ian and how we produce reality.
So I believe that we have about 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So part of what I think we're trying to do at the Serpentine at the moment, more broadly, but it does specifically relate to technology, is to work with artists on an ongoing basis and to develop new ideas within the marathon as a kind of R&D lab that then leads into commissions and then leads to exhibitions and then leads back to kind of something that resembles artist placements and future programs that we're developing in this moment. So our first work with Ian Cheng was a mindfulness app called Bad Corgi. You can download it on your phone. Fast forward, or maybe it's nice to play it for a moment. No. So the objective of Bad Corgi is to herd sheep in the desert before a large rubbish bag eats you. And this led, about a year and a half later, to the current exhibition that is on the Serpentine, where we worked with Ian to develop a life form called, an artificial life form called Bob. Bob stands for Bag of Beliefs. And we spent about 6 or 7 months working with Ian to conceive of this individual simulated being. For those that are not familiar with Ian Cheng's work, primarily he works with simulations. This was the first time that Ian had developed a single entity. One thing I think that's particularly relevant to the discussion around the kind of neologisms of artificial intelligence is that when we say artificial intelligence in this moment, it's usually as a result of the explosion in the innovations around machine learning. Ian actually works with what people often refer to as good old-fashioned AI. So he develops symbolic languages that essentially inform the way in which Bob lives in the world, the way in which Bob thinks. Bob is able to interact with you. So we ostensibly are Bob's spirit world, and you can access or Skype into Bob's world through a device in the galleries. Bob can die. Bob requires feeding every day. The gallery assistants at the Serpentine are, in some ways, not zookeepers. They are carers, because Bob can leave at any time. Sometimes Bob does leave. I've realized that we've gone 1 minute over time. We have to move into our next panel. So with that said, I would just encourage everybody to come to the Serpentine and see Ian Cheng and specifically Bob. And alongside Ian Cheng is Sondra Perry's show Typhoon coming on, which is also an exceptional exhibition. Hans-Ulrich, is there anything you want to add in the last 10 seconds?
No, you're right. We promised to Schumann that it's not going to be a marathon. And indeed, Sondra Perry, we need to maybe say just a few words on Sondra Perry, because Sondra also addresses technology in such an interesting way. She explores the intersection of Black identity, digital culture, and power structure through video, media installation, and performance. What is very important is all of this work is open source, and that's very much, in the center of what we believe at the Serpentine. We are free admission. We believe in art for all, and this idea that basically Sondra's work is all open source, and the entire exhibition is open source is a very important dimension. And we hope you can all come to London. As Schumann said this afternoon, Bob is Bob, and everything else is everything else. It's a Bob world after all. Thank you very much.